By 6:12 on Christmas morning, my phone showed 99 missed calls. My mother had called 23 times. My father had called 17. My sister Brittany had filled the rest of the screen, along with 6 numbers I didn't recognize and one I did. Patrick Doyle, the retired deputy who had signed the report saying my husband was driving the night he died. I stood in my dark kitchen, still wearing the navy scrubs from my double shift in the ER. On the counter beside me lay the copy of the letter I had left on my parents' doorstep less than an hour earlier. I had not accused anyone. I had written only that Chloe recognized the man sitting in her father's chair, that she had recovered the final 4 minutes of our last Christmas video, and that every file connected to Nathan's crash needed to be preserved. Then I played my mother's newest voicemail. Her voice was thin and breathless. "Megan, before you do something that destroys this family, you need to understand that Brittany wasn't driving." I stopped the recording. Behind me, my 16-year-old daughter stood wrapped in a blanket, her eyes swollen from the Christmas Eve she had spent alone. "Mom," she whispered, "you never said Aunt Brittany was driving." She was right. I hadn't. But someone in that house had just told me exactly which truth they were afraid I had found. Stay with me to find out what happened behind that Christmas door, and subscribe to the channel for more stories about the secrets families believe they can bury. The afternoon before, I had been standing in our kitchen with one hand around a travel mug and the other checking the hospital staffing app for the 3rd time, hoping a name would appear beside the empty overnight slot. No one had taken it. A respiratory therapist had called out sick, 2 nurses were already covering extra rooms, and the emergency department had been running near capacity since noon. I had finished my regular shift at 4, but instead of driving home for Christmas Eve, I was preparing to go back for another 8 hours. I hated leaving Chloe alone on a holiday. But emergency rooms did not close because families wanted dinner together. People still crashed cars, stopped breathing, fell on ice, and arrived terrified under fluorescent lights. Someone had to be there when they did. Chloe came down the stairs, carrying a small silver gift box with a white ribbon. Her coat was already zipped, and her car keys were looped carefully around one finger, as if she were afraid they might disappear. She had earned her license 3 weeks earlier. Most 16-year-olds I knew treated a new license like a declaration of freedom. Chloe treated hers like a medical instrument. She checked every mirror twice, braked long before stop signs, and kept both hands fixed on the wheel, even when the car was parked. If another driver followed too closely, her shoulders tightened until they nearly touched her ears. For 4 years, she had heard the same version of how Nathan died. The road had been icy. He had lost control. He had made one terrible mistake. Nathan had been the person who first taught her to respect a car. When she was little, he let her sit in the driver's seat of his parked truck and explained what every pedal did. He never called driving fun until after he called it a responsibility. That was the man I remembered. But grief had taught me not to fight every contradiction. Some memories hurt too much when held beside an official report. "What's in the box?" I asked. Chloe turned it so I could read the label she had written in careful black letters. "Our Last Christmas with Dad, restored by Chloe." For her media class, she had spent weeks digitizing old family recordings from phones, camcorders, and forgotten memory cards. She had repaired damaged audio, corrected color, and organized everything by date. The Christmas footage from 4 years earlier had mattered most to her, because it was the last holiday Nathan had spent with us. "I thought Grandma and Grandpa might want to watch it tonight," she said. "Even Aunt Brittany. We don't really talk about Dad anymore." There was no accusation in her voice. That made it worse. "They'll want to see it," I told her, because I believed they would. My parents had failed me in smaller ways over the years, but I still wanted to believe they loved Chloe enough to remember her father kindly. My phone buzzed with a message from my mother, Judith. "Chloe's place is saved at dinner. Her old room is ready if the roads get bad. We're still doing the Christmas Eve open house, so a few neighbors will be here too." I showed Chloe the message. She smiled with visible relief. The forecast had been warning about falling temperatures all afternoon. Light snow was expected by evening, with freezing drizzle possible after 8. Under any other circumstances, I would not have let a newly licensed teenager make the trip alone. But my parents lived less than 20 minutes away. The roads were still clear, and my mother had promised Chloe could stay overnight. "You do not drive home if there's ice," I said. "I don't care if you feel awkward. You call me or you sleep there." "I know. Leave extra distance. No sudden braking. Text me the second you arrive." "I know, Mom." She said it patiently, not dismissively. Chloe understood that my rules came from fear, and I understood that too many rules could turn fear into a cage. She pulled on a pair of dark wool gloves before picking up the gift box. Nathan had bought them for her during the last winter he was alive. They were too big then. Now they fit. At the door, she paused. "You're sure you'll be okay working all night?" "I'll be busy enough not to notice." That wasn't what I asked. I kissed her forehead. "Go have Christmas. I'll call when I get a break." I watched from the porch as she backed slowly out of the driveway, checked both directions twice, and eased onto the street. Then I followed the small blue dot on my phone while I drove toward the hospital. It moved steadily through town, never speeding, never making a wrong turn. When it stopped at my parents' address, a message appeared. "Madait." I sent back a heart and put my phone in my scrub pocket. For the next half hour, the emergency department was almost peaceful. Then the county alert came through. A chain reaction crash had happened on the interstate. Multiple vehicles, possible entrapment. Ambulances were already on the way. Within minutes, every available room was being prepared. I tied my hair back, pulled on gloves, and stepped into the first trauma bay as paramedics rolled in a man with blood soaking through the side of his coat. Another stretcher followed, before we had finished transferring him. My phone vibrated once against my hip, then again. I could not reach for it while I was holding pressure on a wound and calling out vital signs. By the time I stepped away, stripped off my gloves, and looked at the screen, nearly 20 minutes had passed. One missed call from Chloe. One message. "Mom, Aunt Brittany says there's no room for me." For a second, the noise around me seemed to drop away. I called immediately. Chloe answered on the 4th ring. I heard the soft rush of the car heater and the click of a turn signal. "Where are you?" "I'm almost home." "Why are you driving?" "Your grandmother said you could stay." "It's okay, Mom. Don't leave work." "I'm fine." She spoke too carefully, placing a pause between each sentence. Chloe had done that since childhood whenever she was trying not to cry. "What happened at the house?" "Nothing. Aunt Brittany said the table was full." "With the neighbors?" Another pause. "Chloe, pull over somewhere safe if you need to." "I'm close to home. The road's getting shiny near the edges, so I'm going slow." My chest tightened. My 16-year-old daughter, licensed for 3 weeks, was driving alone through falling temperatures after the adults who had promised her a bed had sent her away. "I'm going to find someone to cover me." "No, there are injured people there. Just call me when you can." She was comforting me when I should have been protecting her. I pressed my fingers against my forehead and forced my voice to stay even. "Tell me exactly what you saw." Her breath caught before she answered. "There were people inside, Mom. Neighbors. And someone was sitting in my chair." Someone was sitting in my chair. I wanted Chloe to explain, but another ambulance was already backing into the bay. A nurse called my name from behind the trauma room curtain, and the alarm on a cardiac monitor began to sound. "Get inside the house," I told her. "Lock the door and text me when you're safely in." "I will. I'm calling Grandma." "Mom, don't." "Not yet." There was something in her voice beyond embarrassment. She sounded confused, as though she had seen a picture that did not fit inside the frame she had always known. Before I could ask another question, a physician waved me toward the next patient. I did not learn exactly what happened on my parents' doorstep until later. Chloe told me in pieces, first over the phone and then with the details she had held back because she knew I was trapped at work. She had arrived a few minutes before 6. The snow was still light then, just a thin dusting collecting along the curbs and whitening the tops of the hedges. My parents' house glowed at the end of the street, every front window lit, a wreath hanging above the garage, and electric candles lined along the porch rail. Cars filled both sides of the driveway. Chloe recognized several from the neighborhood open house my mother hosted every Christmas Eve. She had expected them. My mother had warned us there would be guests, but she had also promised that Chloe's place at dinner was saved, and her old bedroom was ready if the roads became unsafe. Chloe parked carefully at the curb, checked that she was not blocking a mailbox, and sat for a moment with both hands still on the steering wheel. She told me she had felt proud. It was the first family gathering she had driven to by herself. In the passenger seat were a covered apple crisp, the small silver gift box, and an overnight bag with pajamas, a toothbrush, and the book she was reading. She had even packed the old sleeping shirt she wore whenever she stayed with my parents, because my mother always kept the upstairs rooms too warm. She carried everything up the walk in 2 trips. By the time she returned with the gift box and her overnight bag, snow had settled in the grooves of her shoes. Through the front window, she could see people moving around the living room with glasses and paper plates. She heard laughter before she rang the bell. Someone inside had turned up Christmas music, and for a few seconds she stood there listening to a song Nathan used to sing badly while hanging lights. Brittany opened the door. She was wearing a cream sweater and gold earrings, dressed as if she had been hosting the party herself. She stepped onto the welcome mat, but kept one hand on the door, leaving only a narrow opening behind her. Chloe smiled and lifted the gift slightly. "Merry Christmas." Brittany's eyes moved over the overnight bag first, then the covered dessert. "What are you doing here?" "Grandma invited me. The table's already full." Chloe thought she had misunderstood. She could hear dishes being moved in the dining room and smell roasted meat from the kitchen. Over Brittany's shoulder, she saw the end of the table, crowded but not full. 2 folded chairs were still leaning against the wall beneath a framed family photograph. "Grandma said she saved me a seat." Plans changed. Chloe looked at the overnight bag in her hand. "She also said I could stay if the roads got bad." Brittany did not answer. Her gaze had dropped to the silver box. The label faced outward. "Our last Christmas with Dad. Restored by Chloe." Chloe said. Brittany's fingers tightened around the edge of the door. Her eyes moved quickly toward the dining room, then back to the box. The change was small, but Chloe noticed it because Brittany had stopped looking annoyed and started looking afraid. "What is that?" Brittany asked. "It's a video I made for everyone." "Give it to me. I thought we could watch it together." Brittany's voice became colder. "Not tonight." Chloe shifted the box against her coat. "Why?" Someone behind Brittany asked who was at the door. Instead of answering Chloe, Brittany looked over her shoulder and said loudly enough for the room to hear, "There's no room for her at the table." She did not say there was no room for Chloe. She said there was no room for her, as though my daughter were a stranger who had arrived without an invitation. The music and conversation behind Brittany softened. Chloe saw several faces turn toward the hallway. No one came forward. She glanced past her aunt again. Mrs. Lawson from across the street was seated near the fireplace. The Parkers were standing beside the piano. A couple Chloe barely knew had brought their adult son. There were neighbors inside who had spoken to her only a few times in her life, while she remained outside holding a dessert and an overnight bag. "You invited the neighbors," Chloe said. Brittany's mouth tightened. "This is an adult arrangement. You don't know what was planned." "I was planned," Grandma texted Mom. "Don't start making a scene." "I'm not making a scene. I'm standing outside." My mother appeared behind Brittany then. Chloe expected her to move her aside, or at least ask why her granddaughter was still on the porch in the cold. Judith looked at the bags, the gift, and the snow collecting in Chloe's hair. Her eyes paused on the writing across the silver box. She did not open the door wider. "Chloe," she said, lowering her voice, "don't make this awkward on Christmas Eve." Chloe stared at her. You told me my room was ready. My mother pressed her lips together. Your aunt says tonight isn't a good time. The roads are getting worse. You live less than 20 minutes away. Chloe later told me that was the moment she understood no one inside was going to stop Brittany. My mother knew a 16-year-old who had been driving for only 3 weeks would have to return alone after dark. She knew freezing drizzle was expected. She had promised Chloe a bed. None of that mattered enough for her to step outside. My father was visible farther down the hallway. Robert stood near the dining room entrance, with one hand resting on the back of a chair. Chloe called, "Grandpa?" He looked toward her, then immediately lowered his eyes to the floor. That hurt her more than Brittany's words. As Chloe turned slightly, she finally saw the man sitting where my mother had always placed her at Christmas dinner. It was the chair nearest the kitchen, the one Chloe had used since she was tall enough to sit without a booster cushion. The man had silver hair combed straight back and a pale scar running near his right temple. A small metal clip shaped like a badge held his tie in place. He was older than my parents, or perhaps just more tired. He was not talking with the neighbors. He was watching the doorway. When his eyes met Chloe's, he looked first at her face and then at the silver box in her hands. His expression changed, but he did not speak. He lowered his head and stared at the plate in front of him. Chloe could not place him then. She only knew he was sitting in the seat my grandmother had promised her. "I brought this for all of you," she said, holding up the box one last time. Brittany stepped farther onto the porch, forcing Chloe backward. "Take it home." Then she shut the door. No one inside opened it again. Chloe walked to the car with the gift box pressed against her chest. She put the overnight bag and apple crisp in the back seat, then sat behind the wheel without starting the engine. Her eyes burned, but she refused to cry. Nathan had once told her that when she was upset behind the wheel, she should stop, breathe, and wait until she could see clearly. Tears could blur the road as easily as fog. She counted 10 slow breaths. Snow ticked against the windshield. The dashboard temperature had fallen below freezing, and the edges of the street reflected the porch lights with a faint glassy shine. She called me. I did not answer. No one from the house came outside. No one offered to drive her home, call a car, or let her sit in the entryway until the roads improved. Chloe started the engine and drove away. She stayed below the speed limit, left more space than usual at every intersection, and kept both hands on the wheel exactly as Nathan had taught her. The snow thickened slightly but never became a storm. The danger was quieter than that. It lay in the dark patches gathering near the shoulders, and the thin glaze beginning to form where the wind crossed open fields. When she reached our driveway, she texted me that she was home. She carried the silver box inside, left the overnight bag by the door, and placed the untouched apple crisp on the kitchen counter. The house was cold and dark except for the lights on the Christmas tree. Chloe set the gift beneath it and sat on the floor without taking off her coat. She kept thinking about the man in her chair. Something about the scar, the silver hair, and the badge-shaped tie clip tugged at a memory. She opened her laptop and searched for articles about Nathan's accident. Most repeated the same details she had heard for 4 years. Icy road, loss of control, single occupant. Then she found the photograph from the original report. A uniformed deputy stood near the wrecked vehicle, speaking to a reporter. The picture was grainy, but the scar beside his temple was visible. My phone buzzed while I was washing blood from my hands at the ER sink. Chloe had sent me the article with the man's face enlarged. I called her as soon as I could step into the hallway. "Why are you sure that's the same person?" I asked. Her answer came without hesitation. "That's him, the officer who said Dad was alone." I stared at the photograph Chloe had sent until the face beside the wrecked car blurred on my screen. Patrick Doyle had been younger then, but the scar near his temple was unmistakable. 4 years earlier, he had stood beside me in a hospital room and delivered the facts in a careful voice. Nathan had been alone. The road had iced over. He had lost control. I believed him because my husband was dead. My daughter was 12, and I could barely remember how to breathe. A nurse pushed through the doors behind me and said another ambulance was 5 minutes out. I forced myself to lower the phone. "Chloe, lock every door," I said. "Keep your phone beside you. I'm going to call as soon as I can step away again." "Are you coming home?" The question was quiet, and I hated the answer before I gave it. "I'm trying to find coverage." No one was available. The interstate crash had filled every trauma room, and I could not walk out while patients were still arriving with no one to take my assignment. That did not make the image of Chloe sitting alone beneath our tree easier to bear. I video called her twice during brief gaps. First, she was still wearing her coat. Later, she sat on the sofa beneath a blanket. The apple crisp remained untouched on the counter, and the silver box was still beneath the tree. "Did you eat?" I asked. "I'm not hungry. There's soup in the refrigerator." "I know," she said, but her face had the stillness that came after crying. I told her I loved her and returned to work feeling that I was caring for every frightened family except my own. My replacement finally came through the doors shortly after 1 in the morning. I completed the handoff, changed out of my isolation gown, and drove home through streets glazed at the edges with ice. The trip took longer than usual, because I kept imagining Chloe making the same drive alone. It was 1:15 when I opened our front door. The Christmas tree was still lit, casting red and gold across the dark living room. The kitchen was unlit. Chloe slept curled on the sofa beneath a blanket, her coat still zipped to her chin. One of Nathan's gloves rested near her cheek. The silver box remained unopened under the tree. Guilt rose quickly, but it was not useful unless it changed what I did next. I crossed the room, knelt beside her, and touched her shoulder. "I'm home." Her eyes opened slowly. For one startled second, she looked like the 12-year-old I had found awake after the hospital called about Nathan. Then she recognized me and pushed herself upright. "I'm sorry," I said. "I should have been here. You had patience. You're my daughter. Both things can be true." I helped her out of her coat, warmed the soup, and put 2 bowls on the table. She claimed she still was not hungry, but once I sat across from her and lifted my spoon, she began eating too. Between small bites, she told me everything she had not said on the phone. Brittany's hand tightening when she saw the label on the box. My mother refusing to let her stay. My father looking at the floor. Doyle sitting in the chair Judith had promised to save for her. "Did he say anything to you?" I asked. "No." He looked at me, then at the gift. It was like he knew what was inside. He couldn't have known. Maybe Aunt Brittany told him. I looked toward the tree. "Did you tell anyone what footage you restored?" "Just Grandma. I said I was making a Christmas video, but I didn't tell her which clips worked." Patrick Doyle's name brought back a gray hospital room. He had said Nathan was the only occupant, and that sometimes good drivers made one bad decision on ice. For years, that sentence followed Chloe whenever tires slipped on snow. She glanced at the box beneath the tree. "Can we watch it tonight?" She nodded before I could answer. "I wanted to have Christmas dinner with Dad. I guess this is the only way I can now." I carried the laptop to the table while she retrieved the USB. Her fingers hesitated before inserting it. Hope and fear moved across her face at the same time, as though seeing Nathan again might comfort her or take him away a second time. The video opened with uneven footage from Christmas Eve 2022. 12-year-old Chloe laughed whenever Nathan turned the camera toward her. He appeared in fragments, reflected in a window, straightening the tree, carrying a tray through my parents' kitchen. Then the camera changed hands. Nathan's face filled the screen as he teased Chloe about filming the floor instead of the family. His voice came through the speakers clear and alive. "Hold it steady, kiddo. Give people a chance to remember us properly." Beside me, Chloe pressed both hands around her bowl. I wanted to pause, but she shook her head. The footage moved through dinner preparations. My mother arranged place cards. My father carved the roast. Brittany stood near the kitchen island with a glass in her hand, speaking louder than everyone else and laughing before anyone finished a sentence. Twice, Judith removed the glass from beside her. Twice, Brittany found another one. Nothing there proved a crime. It showed behavior I had once dismissed as ordinary. The final file was marked as repaired. Chloe explained that the original recording had frozen after the image shook, but the data beneath it had still been recoverable. She clicked play. The camera appeared to be lying on a side table, angled toward the entryway. Brittany moved in and out of frame, opening drawers and patting the pockets of coats. "Where are my keys?" she demanded. Nathan stepped into view, holding a key ring. "You're not driving." Brittany reached for the keys. "I'm fine. You can barely stand still." Brittany reached again. Nathan lifted them out of reach, but Robert entered from the dining room and frowned at the noise. "Just take your sister home, Nathan," my father said. "We've had enough drama for one night. I'm not driving her anywhere if she's fighting me for the wheel." Brittany lunged again and managed to tear the key ring from his hand. Nathan looked toward my father. "I'm going with her. If she starts the car, I'll make her pull over." From somewhere beyond the camera's view, my mother's voice cut through the room. "Nathan, don't let her drive." The door opened. Cold air stirred a strand of tinsel near the lens. Brittany left first with the keys clenched in her hand. Nathan followed seconds later. The screen went black. Chloe immediately opened the file details. The timestamp showed they had left my parents' house less than 30 minutes before the crash. I pulled up the copy of the official report I had kept with Nathan's papers. It stated that Nathan had departed the gathering alone. It identified him as the sole occupant of the vehicle. We watched the final minute again. Then once more. I did not say Brittany had been driving. The video did not prove it. Nathan could have taken the keys outside, or they could have changed places. But one fact no longer moved. My family had lied about Brittany being in the car. "Do you think Grandma knew this video existed?" Chloe asked. I looked at the silver box and remembered how Brittany's expression had changed before she closed the door. "I think they knew enough to be afraid of what you brought." We left the original file untouched. I copied it to an external drive and uploaded another copy to a private account. On paper, I recorded the time, the original device, each action we took, and that only Chloe and I had handled it that night. At 2:07 the morning, my phone vibrated across the table. A new voicemail from my mother appeared. I put it on speaker. Judith did not ask whether Chloe had made it home safely. She did not apologize for sending her granddaughter. Her voice came through low and urgent. "Whatever Chloe thinks she saw, Brittany wasn't driving." I looked at my daughter. Neither of us spoke for several seconds, because neither of us had told anyone that was what we suspected. I did not return my mother's call. Every part of me wanted to demand an explanation, but Judith's voicemail had already taught me something important. She had denied an accusation I had not made. If I called while she was frightened, she would learn exactly what Chloe and I knew, and the family would have time to rebuild the same story before anyone outside the house could examine it. I saved the voicemail, took screenshots of the call log, and wrote down the time it arrived. Then I called the attorney, who had handled Nathan's estate after the accident. He answered in a tired voice, and became fully alert when I explained that we had recovered old footage contradicting the police report. He did not ask me to send the video immediately. Instead, he told me to stop touching the original device. "Do not rename the file, trim it, enhance it, or forward the original," he said. "Keep the device powered off when you aren't using it. You can preserve copies, but document where each copy came from." I looked at the notes I had already made. "We did that. Good. Do not post any part of it online, even if your family starts attacking you publicly. Do not meet your parents, your sister, or Doyle alone. Most importantly, request preservation of every government record connected to the crash before anyone has a chance to claim it was routinely deleted." The word deleted sent a chill through me. What records? The complete accident report, all supplements, 911 audio, dispatch logs, body camera data, vehicle location records, photographs, and anything stored under a related incident number. Ask them to preserve metadata and archived material, not just what appears in the public file. While Chloe sat beside me at the kitchen table, I drafted the request. I used neutral language and made no allegation. I stated that newly recovered family footage appeared to conflict with the recorded timeline of Nathan Foster's fatal crash, and that litigation or a formal review might follow. I requested immediate preservation of the report, 911 recordings, dispatch records, body camera files, and associated logs. The attorney reviewed it before I sent it to the county records office and the agency responsible for the original investigation. Chloe watched the message leave my outbox. Does that mean they're going to arrest Aunt Brittany? No. It means no one gets to erase anything while we figure out what happened. Her eyes moved toward the USB. I'm the one who found it. You recovered a family video. If I hadn't taken it there, none of this would be happening. I turned my chair toward her. What happened 4 years ago is the reason this is happening. What Aunt Brittany did at the door is the reason we looked closer. You did not create any of it. But Grandma sounded scared. People are often scared when the truth stops belonging only to them. She lowered her gaze to Nathan's glove in her lap. I could not promise that the truth would make her feel better. I could only promise that she would not carry responsibility for the choices adults had made. The attorney advised me to put the family on notice without revealing the contents of the video. I wrote a short letter, printed 2 copies, and signed one. Chloe recognized the man sitting in Nathan's chair. She also recovered the final 4 minutes of our last Christmas video. The original file has been copied, and I have requested preservation of every record connected to Nathan's crash. Do not contact my daughter. I did not accuse Brittany of driving. I did not mention my mother's voicemail. I did not say what the final 4 minutes showed. Just before dawn, I drove to my parents' house alone. The roads were mostly empty, and a thin layer of frozen mist silvered the lawns. Their Christmas lights were still on, but the downstairs windows were dark. I placed the letter inside a clear envelope and secured it to the front door where the camera would record me leaving it. I did not ring the bell. I did not wait for anyone to wake. On the drive home, my phone began vibrating in the cup holder. First my mother, then Brittany, then my father. I turned it face down and kept driving. Chloe had fallen asleep on the sofa again. I changed out of my scrubs, set my phone to silent, and lay beside her beneath the same blanket. For 4 years, my family had controlled the story by deciding what information reached me and when. I was no longer going to let their panic determine my next move. When I woke, pale daylight had filled the room. My phone showed 99 missed calls. 23 were from Judith. 17 were from Robert. Brittany had called so many times that her name filled most of the screen. 6 unfamiliar numbers appeared among them, along with repeated calls from Patrick Doyle. I listened to the messages in the order they had arrived and took notes. My mother's first voicemail was soft and maternal. Megan, Chloe was emotional last night. Brittany may have handled the situation poorly, but we were trying to keep her from becoming overwhelmed by adult matters. Her next message claimed Chloe had misunderstood who was sitting in the chair. By the 4th, she was no longer pretending the evening had been ordinary. Please don't involve strangers in something that belongs inside this family. My father's tone was firmer. Whatever you think you found, there is an explanation. Bring the video here, and we'll discuss it privately. He called again 12 minutes later. You don't need attorneys. Nathan was family. We should handle his memory as a family. Brittany began by demanding that I answer. Then she demanded that I delete the footage, because Chloe had no right to distribute recordings made inside my parents' home. Her 5th voicemail contradicted the first 4. I wasn't in that car, Megan. Nathan left alone. Another message from my mother said, Brittany was there, but Nathan was driving. My father followed with, Everyone was confused that night. You cannot treat imperfect memories like evidence. The three of them were no longer repeating the same story. One unfamiliar caller identified herself as a neighbor who had attended the open house. She said she did not know why Doyle was there, and another caller asked why the retired deputy had left the party so suddenly after my letter was found. A third said my parents had begun calling guests before sunrise, asking what they remembered about the seating arrangement. Their effort to control the witnesses had started before they knew what those witnesses had seen. Doyle's messages were different. The first two asked me to call him. The next said the situation was more complicated than my family would admit. His final message was only 14 seconds long. I need to tell you what I did before they decide what I'm allowed to say. I replayed it twice. The wording made me think he had been receiving money or pressure from my parents for years. Perhaps he had appeared at dinner because he wanted more. Perhaps the review of the old records had frightened him, and he was now trying to sell the truth to whichever side offered him the safest escape. I forwarded the message to the attorney. "We do not meet him alone," I said. "We don't," he agreed. "If Doyle wants to speak, the conversation will be scheduled, witnessed, and preserved. He does not get to trade fragments of information for promises." A car pulled into my driveway while we were still on the phone. Brittany got out without a coat and marched toward the porch. Chloe moved instinctively toward the window, but I guided her back. "You don't have to talk to her." Brittany rang the bell, knocked, then leaned close to the camera. "I know you're watching," she said. "You're going to destroy Mom and Dad over 4 minutes of old footage." I did not answer. She did not ask what the video showed. She did not mention the voicemail in which my mother had denied she was driving. She only knew that 4 minutes existed and that the original had been copied. That meant Brittany did not know what else I had found, because I had found nothing else yet. After several minutes, she returned to her car. I saved the doorbell recording and added it to the timeline. That afternoon, Doyle agreed to speak by phone with my attorney present, and the call formally documented. Before the attorney joined, Doyle refused to answer any questions. Once he heard that the conversation was being preserved, his breathing changed. My attorney began with a simple statement. "Mr. Doyle, Megan has made no promises to you. She is not agreeing to withhold evidence, limit a complaint, or influence any investigation. Do you understand?" "Yes." "Then tell us why you contacted her." There was a long silence on the line. When Doyle finally spoke, his voice sounded older than it had in the news photograph. "The report wasn't wrong because of what I saw," he said. "It was wrong because of what I agreed not to write." The phone call ended without Doyle explaining what he had agreed not to write. My attorney stopped him before he could offer fragments without context and arranged a formal meeting for the following afternoon. We met in a conference room at his law office, halfway between my house and the county building. It was deliberately neutral, with no family photographs, no Christmas decorations, and no chance for anyone to claim they had been cornered inside a private home. A digital recorder sat in the center of the table, beside a legal pad and a glass pitcher of water. Doyle arrived early. He wore a dark wool coat over a shirt, buttoned incorrectly at the collar. Without his uniform, he looked smaller than the man I remembered from the hospital, but the scar beside his right temple was the same one Chloe had recognized across my parents' dining room. He glanced at me, then at my attorney. "Is your daughter here?" "No," I said. "You don't speak to Chloe." He nodded quickly. "I wasn't going to upset her. You were sitting in her chair after she was sent onto an icy road." His eyes dropped to the table. "I didn't know they were going to turn her away." My attorney reminded him that the conversation was being recorded, and that nothing I said could be interpreted as a promise of protection. Doyle accepted the terms, though his fingers tightened around the untouched glass of water. He began with the county's new digital records project. Old crash reports, dispatch recordings, and body camera logs were being transferred from several outdated systems into a searchable archive. During the process, an auditor had noticed that the file connected to Nathan's crash listed a body camera activation, but did not contain a complete recording. The report also referenced an audio attachment that could not be found under Nathan's incident number. The auditor asked whether equipment had failed, Doyle said. I told him I didn't remember. Did you remember? My attorney asked. Doyle stared at the recorder. I remembered enough. 2 days before Christmas, he had called Robert and said he could no longer guarantee the original report would survive review. He intended to correct what he had written before someone else uncovered the discrepancies. My parents did not invite him to dinner. On Christmas Eve, Doyle drove to their house without warning. Judith's annual open house was already underway, with neighbors moving between the living room and dining room. Robert met Doyle in the entryway and refused to discuss anything while guests were present. I said I wanted 5 minutes alone, Doyle told us. Robert said there would be no private conversation until everyone left. He thought I wouldn't make a scene in front of half the neighborhood. So he kept you there, I said. Doyle nodded. Your mother put me at the table, in Chloe's seat. I didn't know it was hers. It was possible he was telling the truth about the chair. It changed nothing about the fact that he stayed. Doyle said Brittany became agitated the moment Chloe appeared at the door carrying the silver box. From where he sat, he could read part of the label. He saw Brittany look at the words about the last Christmas video, then look directly at him. She knew Chloe might recognize me, he said. And if that video was played in front of everyone, she didn't know what might be on it. So she sent a 16-year-old home alone. I didn't hear what was said at the door. You saw Chloe standing there. Yes. And you remained seated. Doyle's jaw tightened, but he did not deny it. My attorney asked him to describe the original report. Doyle took a slow breath. The statement that Nathan was the only person in the vehicle was not accurate. The words were quieter than I expected. 4 years of certainty collapsed without any dramatic confession, just a retired officer admitting that one sentence in an official document had been deliberately false. You knew Brittany was involved, I said. I knew she had been near the scene. That isn't the same answer. It's the answer I can give without claiming I saw something I didn't. He said he arrived after Brittany had already left the vehicle. Nathan was lying outside it, unconscious. Because Nathan was found beyond the passenger compartment, and the car was registered to him, Doyle claimed he had inferred that Nathan had been driving. I thought of the family video, Brittany leaving with the keys, my mother telling Nathan not to let her drive, the official report saying she had never been there. You didn't infer she was absent, I said. You wrote that she was absent. Doyle rubbed his thumb against the rim of the glass. I was told she had not been inside the car when it crashed. By whom? He did not answer. My attorney shifted to the money. Doyle admitted that Robert had given him a substantial personal loan several days after Nathan died. He claimed the loan had helped him cover debts from his wife's medical treatment and insisted he had intended to repay it. Did you? My attorney asked. Not all of it. Was there a written agreement? No. Interest? No. Repayment schedule? Doyle looked down. No. It was not a loan. He could call it that because the word sounded less criminal than payment, but the absence of paperwork did not change its purpose. Doyle wanted to confess enough to appear cooperative. He admitted the report was false, that Brittany had been near the scene, and that money changed hands. Yet, every time we approached the question of who had been inside the car, he retreated behind what he claimed not to have witnessed. He was not trying to tell the full truth. He was trying to calculate the smallest truth that might protect him from the largest consequence. Still, he gave us information no one else had provided. He wrote down Nathan's original incident number and the identification code used by the county's former evidence storage system. He also supplied the number of another accident that occurred on the same stretch of road that night. According to Doyle, a dispatch audio file had been attached to that second case by mistake. He had noticed the error years earlier and never corrected it. My attorney contacted the county review unit before Doyle left. By evening, an investigator named Dana Ruiz had been assigned to evaluate whether the records justified reopening the case. Dana met us the next morning in a secure interview room at the county administration building. She was direct without being cold and made no promises about arrests, charges, or public corrections. "This will not be resolved because one officer says his report was incomplete," she told me. "We need to authenticate the video, recover the underlying records, establish who knew what, and separate direct observation from family interpretation." I handed over the original USB inside the silver gift box. Dana photographed it where it lay, documented the transfer, and sealed it in an evidence bag. She also accepted the working copy and the notes Chloe and I had made when preserving the file. Watching the box disappear into official custody felt strangely painful. Chloe had created it as a Christmas gift. Now it carried an evidence label. Dana interviewed me first. I described the original notification of Nathan's death, Doyle's statements at the hospital, my mother's unsolicited voicemail, the letter I left, and the conflicting calls that followed. Chloe's interview took place with me present, and a trained youth advocate sitting beside her. Dana explained that Chloe did not need to solve anything. She only needed to describe what she had personally seen and heard. Chloe told her about Brittany's reaction to the label, the unused folding chairs, Judith refusing to let her stay, and Doyle sitting in the chair reserved for her. When Dana asked what Chloe believed Doyle had done, Chloe looked at me. I shook my head slightly. "I don't know," she said. "I only know he was there, and he was the officer in the old photograph." Dana nodded. "That distinction matters." For the first time since Christmas Eve, I saw some of the pressure leave Chloe's shoulders. She did not have to prove who was guilty. She only had to tell the truth about her own experience. 2 days later, Dana called us back. The old evidence storage system had contained the misplaced dispatch file exactly where Doyle said it would be. The recording was damaged, but the first caller's voice remained clear. Dana played it in the same interview room. A woman spoke over the sound of wind and distant traffic. She said a car had left the road and rolled near the county marker. Then her breathing changed, as though she had just seen movement beside the wreck. "There's a woman in a red coat climbing out of the driver's side." Dana stopped the recording. Beside the monitor, she placed a still image taken from Chloe's restored family video. Brittany stood near my parents' entryway, a set of keys in her hand, and a red winter coat buttoned around her. The recording did not prove the woman was my sister. The photograph did not prove who had been behind the wheel when the car crashed. But together they established a witness the final report had never mentioned. Dana turned the image toward Doyle. "Why was this witness removed from the final report?" Doyle looked at the red coat, then at the recorder on the table. He did not answer. Doyle never answered Dana's question in that room. His attorney ended the interview, and the silence he left behind became another piece of the case, though not one we could yet use as proof. The investigation moved forward in the slow way real investigations do. Christmas decorations disappeared from storefronts, snowbanks hardened along the roads, and I returned to regular shifts at the ER while Dana and her team rebuilt one night from records, timestamps, and people who had spent 4 years assuming someone else had already told the truth. The woman who called 911 was named Ellen Park. Dana found her through the archived subscriber information attached to the misplaced recording. Ellen lived in another county now, but she agreed to a formal interview. I was not present for it. Dana later gave my attorney and me a summary of the information relevant to Nathan's case. Ellen had been driving home with her 6-year-old son when she saw Nathan's car enter the curve ahead of her. The rear of the vehicle swung sideways, corrected once, then spun across the road and dropped into the ditch. It did not look to her like a car simply drifting onto the shoulder. It looked as though the driver had turned too sharply after losing control. Ellen stopped far enough back to avoid sliding into the same ditch. Through the snow and headlights, she saw movement inside the wreck. A woman in a red coat crawled out from the driver's side. Seconds later, a man emerged from the opposite side, stumbled several steps, and collapsed near the road. Ellen called 911. Her son was crying in the back seat, and another vehicle nearly slid into hers while she was stopped. The dispatcher told her help was coming and advised her to move to a safer location. She backed down the road to a wide driveway and waited until she saw emergency lights approaching. No investigator ever asked her to sign a statement. Ellen had assumed the call recording, and the responding officer's report contained what she had seen. When news reports later identified Nathan as the only person in the car, she questioned her own memory. Snow, darkness, and fear could distort things. She had a child beside her and had seen the crash for only seconds. That uncertainty was exactly what Brittany's attorney attacked. Through counsel, Brittany admitted for the first time that she had been in the car that night. She claimed Nathan had taken the wheel after they left my parents' house, then stopped somewhere along the road. According to her new account, they had switched places before the crash, and Ellen had mistaken the sides of the overturned vehicle. Her attorney argued that a 4-year-old memory could not establish who had been driving. The car had rotated in the ditch. Darkness could reverse a witness's sense of direction. The family video showed Brittany carrying the keys, but not who started the engine or who sat behind the wheel when the vehicle left the property. It was a careful defense because parts of it were true. The video did not show the driveway. Ellen had witnessed the crash through falling snow. Nathan had been found outside the vehicle. The evidence was becoming stronger, but it was not complete. While Brittany spoke through lawyers, my mother spoke through relatives. Judith called cousins, former co-workers, and 2 women from her church. She told them I had never recovered from Nathan's death and was tearing apart the family because grief had fixed itself to the wrong target. Several people repeated her language almost word for word when they contacted me. One cousin urged me to think about my parents' age. Another said Chloe would regret losing her grandparents over an interpretation of an old home movie. A woman I had not spoken to in 6 years sent a message saying forgiveness mattered more than blame. I saved every message and replied to none of them. Brittany posted a photograph of my parents' house, covered in snow with a caption about families surviving false accusations. Within hours, comments appeared about jealous sisters, unresolved grief, and the cruelty of reopening old wounds during the holidays. Chloe saw the post before I could shield her from it. She asked, "Should we tell people what was on the video?" "No," I said. "They're making Dad look guilty again." "I know. But the truth does not become stronger because we publish evidence before it has been authenticated. We give everything to Dana, not to strangers online." I wanted to defend Nathan in every comment. I wanted to post my mother's voicemail and let the world hear her deny an accusation no one had made. But a public fight would give Brittany a chance to call the investigation revenge. More importantly, it would turn Chloe's worst Christmas into entertainment for people who had no responsibility toward her. Instead, I kept records. Other people from the open house began contacting me privately. Mrs. Lawson said Judith had invited her family only a few hours before the party, even though the open house was usually planned days ahead. Another neighbor said Robert asked everyone not to question why Doyle had arrived, because he was dealing with something personal. The most useful message came from a woman who had been standing near the kitchen when Chloe rang the bell. She heard Brittany look toward Doyle and whisper to Judith, "If she plays that video, everything changes." Dana collected the message and interviewed the woman separately. It did not prove who drove, but it strengthened the reason Chloe had been turned away. Then the medical review began to shift the case. A forensic consultant re-examined Nathan's original autopsy report alongside photographs of the vehicle. His injuries were more consistent with force patterns commonly seen on the passenger side. The conclusion was not absolute. Nathan had moved after the crash, and being found outside the car complicated any reconstruction. Still, the old assumption that he had occupied the driver's seat was no longer supported as confidently as Doyle's report had claimed. Dana's team then sought legal authority to obtain the limited medical records relevant to Brittany's injuries from that night. I did not see those records until the proper orders had been approved and the information entered into the investigation. Early on Christmas morning, In 2022, Brittany had been treated at a private urgent care clinic in a neighboring town. The chart documented an abrasion across her upper chest and shoulder, a small burn consistent with airbag deployment, and a cut near her hairline that required stitches. Judith had told the clinician that Brittany slipped in a bathroom and struck a cabinet. The injuries did not prove, by themselves, that she drove Nathan's car. Seatbelt marks and airbag bag burns can occur on either side depending on the vehicle and impact. But when placed beside Ellen's call, the red coat and the family video, they narrowed the space in which Brittany's story could survive. Dana showed us cropped medical photographs during a meeting, explaining what could and could not be inferred. Chloe was in the room because the images related to the account she had already given, but I watched her face more closely than the screen. When the photograph of the cut near Brittany's forehead appeared, Chloe looked away. I told her, "You don't need to study this." "I'm okay," she said. "You can be okay and still stop." She closed the folder. On the drive home, she sat rigidly in the passenger seat. Every time another car approached an intersection, her right foot pressed against the floor as though she were reaching for a brake that was not there. "I used to think Dad got careless for 1 second," she said. "That's why I hate driving. 1 second can be enough. I kept my eyes on the road. I thought if someone as careful as him could suddenly do something stupid, then maybe I could too. Maybe it was already in me." The lie had not remained inside a police report. It had entered my daughter's muscles. It lived in the way she gripped the steering wheel, the way she checked a mirror twice, the way her body braced before every patch of ice. My family had not only taken Nathan's name from him, they had taught Chloe to fear becoming her father. That afternoon, Dana called and asked me to come back to the county office. Her voice was controlled, but I could hear that another part of the timeline had changed. When I arrived, she placed the urgent care record beside the original accident report. "Did anyone ever tell you," she asked, "why Brittany needed stitches before sunrise on Christmas morning?" Dana did not answer her own question about Brittany's stitches. She let the medical record remain between us and said the injuries mattered only because the rest of the timeline had begun to close around them. Over the next several days, investigators rebuilt the night of Nathan's crash minute by minute. They used dispatch logs, archived phone records, vehicle location data, and the timestamps preserved inside systems. No one in my family had expected anyone to compare. The crash occurred at approximately 9:17 p.m. on County Road 14. The curve was only 2.3 miles from my parents' house, a 4 or 5 minute drive in winter conditions. That distance explained something that had once seemed impossible. Judith and Robert had not crossed town after receiving a call from police. They had been close enough to reach the ditch almost immediately, because Brittany had contacted them first. Her call to my mother began around 9:18. Ellen Park called 911 about a minute later. Doyle was officially dispatched at 9:22 and arrived at approximately 9:26. My parents reached the scene around 9:23, before the first patrol vehicle and before any officer had informed them that Nathan's car had crashed. Robert's phone location history placed him beside County Road 14 during those minutes. Judith's records showed that after Brittany called her, she placed a direct call to Doyle's personal number before he was assigned to the accident. I read the timeline twice. For 4 years, my parents had told me a deputy called them after Nathan was found. The record showed they were already standing beside the wreck before Doyle arrived. Brittany had called home before anyone called me. Dana did not allow Chloe to sit through the next interview. She had already given her account and authenticated the video. There was no reason to make her listen while adults explained how they had used her father's dying moments. I told Chloe only that investigators had confirmed her grandparents reached the crash before the police. She looked down at her hands. "So Aunt Brittany could call them." "Yes, but nobody called us." I could not soften that truth. No one called us. Doyle returned to the county office with his attorney. I watched through the glass from an adjoining room with my lawyer while Dana placed the timeline in front of him. At first, he repeated the boundaries of his earlier statement. He had not witnessed the crash. Nathan had been outside the car when he arrived. He could not personally identify the driver. Dana did not argue. She asked what he saw at 9:26. Doyle stared at the printed timestamps. Robert's vehicle was on the shoulder. Who was inside it? Judith. And? His attorney shifted beside him. But Doyle finally answered. Brittany. Dana asked him to describe her. She was wearing a red coat. There was blood near her hairline. She was crying and shaking. Was she unconscious? No. Was she unable to speak? No. Where was Nathan? Doyle's face tightened. Near the edge of the road. He had gotten out of the vehicle, or been thrown clear. I don't know which. Was he alive? Yes. Barely. He was breathing. The answer struck me harder than I expected. Doyle had not killed Nathan. He had not moved him away from help or prevented the ambulance from treating him. The emergency response continued, and Nathan's injuries were already catastrophic. The crime was not that Doyle caused his death. It was that, while Nathan still breathed beside the road, the people who called themselves his family were already deciding how his death would be recorded. Dana asked why Brittany was in Robert's vehicle instead of being evaluated by the arriving medics. Doyle swallowed. Judith said she would take her to a clinic. Did you instruct them not to leave? No. Why not? Doyle looked toward the camera, mounted in the interview room. Because Judith asked me not to turn one accident into 2 destroyed lives. He said my mother stood close enough that her voice did not carry to the paramedics. She told him Brittany had already been punished by what happened and that Nathan was unlikely to survive. She said an arrest, a blood test, or a public accusation would destroy her younger daughter's future. Robert reminded Doyle how long they had known each other. Then he said no one had actually seen who was driving. But someone had, Dana said. Ellen Park. I didn't take her statement. You removed her call from the final report. Doyle rubbed both hands over his face. I left it unattached. Dana moved to the body camera log. The camera activated when Doyle stepped from his patrol vehicle. It recorded less than 2 minutes, then stopped for 11 minutes. His patrol car's GPS remained beside the ditch the entire time. What happened during those 11 minutes? Doyle's attorney warned him before he answered, but Doyle seemed too tired to retreat again. Judith kept asking me to help them. Robert said Brittany had not been driving. Brittany said Nathan had taken the keys and left alone. They wanted her gone before more units arrived. So you turned off your camera? Yes. And allowed Robert and Judith to drive her away? Yes. When the camera came back on, Brittany and the red coat were gone. The recording showed Doyle near Nathan's car, speaking as though only one occupant had been involved. Dana placed the original report beside the call from Ellen and the restored family video. You omitted Brittany's presence, she said. You omitted the eyewitness. You wrote that Nathan departed the party alone, even though you had no first-hand basis for that statement. Doyle nodded without lifting his head. 3 days after the crash, Robert transferred money to him. The memo described it as a personal loan. There was no contract, interest rate, repayment date, or record showing that Robert had ever expected the balance to be returned. Doyle still refused to call it payment. He also continued insisting he did not know who was driving. Dana laid out the evidence in front of him. Brittany left the house carrying the keys. Ellen saw a woman in a red coat exit the driver's side. Brittany's injuries were consistent with someone restrained near a deploying airbag. Judith called him before dispatch. My parents removed Brittany before she could be examined at the scene. You may not have watched the car leave the road, Dana said. But you knew the family's account was not an innocent misunderstanding. Doyle's control finally began to break. She was panicking. They were all talking over each other. Was Brittany unable to remember what happened? No. Did she say she had been unconscious? No. Then, what exactly did she tell you? He looked through the glass, as though he knew I was standing on the other side. Doyle said Brittany gave him a complete sequence. Nathan had taken the keys from her inside the house. Nathan had left by himself. Brittany had remained behind and never entered the car. When my parents arrived at the ditch, they were supposedly seeing the wreck for the first time. It was almost identical to the account they repeated to me at the hospital, and for every year afterward. That story had not grown from confusion. It had been constructed before the ambulance carried Nathan away. I thought of every Christmas Brittany had watched Chloe sit beneath my parents' tree. Every birthday when she let my daughter speak carefully about a father she believed had made one fatal mistake. Brittany had not merely accepted the protection her parents offered during a moment of terror. She had supplied the words that protection required. Doyle turned toward me when Dana allowed me into the room. His face held shame, but shame was not the same as innocence, and cooperation was not forgiveness. "Your sister didn't just let us blame Nathan," he said. "She told us exactly what to write." Doyle's admission changed the investigation, but it did not end it. He had confirmed that Brittany supplied the story written into the report. Dana still needed to establish how deliberately my parents helped create that story and how long they had worked to preserve it. Judith and Robert were interviewed separately. My mother arrived with an attorney and the same controlled expression she had used throughout my childhood whenever she wanted everyone to believe she was the only reasonable person in the room. She admitted going to the crash site. Dana placed the phone records in front of her. Brittany called Judith at 9:18 p.m. Ellen Park called 911, roughly 1 minute later. The first ambulance had not even been dispatched when my mother answered her phone. Judith glanced at the page and said she no longer remembered the exact order. Dana asked why she had called Doyle's personal number before he received the official dispatch. "I knew he worked nearby. You called a specific deputy before calling your older daughter." "I was trying to help." "Who were you trying to help?" My mother stopped answering. Robert's interview produced a different kind of denial. He admitted giving Doyle money, but insisted it was repayment for an old favor between friends. According to him, the arrangement had existed months before the crash. The banking records showed otherwise. The money left Robert's account 3 days after Nathan died. There had been no previous transfers, no loan agreement, and no repayment history. When Dana asked why he had described it differently, my father said financial matters inside a friendship were private. Dana replied that a private friendship stopped being private when one man altered an official report and the other paid him. Neither of my parents confessed. Their stories simply became smaller each time the evidence took away another place to hide. Based on the phone records, the undisclosed payment, and Doyle's statement, investigators obtained a lawful search warrant for my parents' house. I was not there when it was served. Dana called my attorney afterward and asked us to come to the county office. She placed several evidence photographs on the table. Inside a fireproof safe in my father's study, investigators had found a thick brown folder. Robert had preserved it for 4 years. The first item was a copy of Brittany's urgent care bill from Christmas morning. The second was a bank record showing the transfer to Doyle. Beneath those were handwritten notes listing the times of Brittany's call, Ellen's 911 report, and Doyle's arrival. Robert had known the sequence with far more precision than he claimed during the interview. The final pages were the most damaging. One contained a handwritten draft of the statement later attributed to my family. Nathan took the keys. Nathan left alone. Brittany remained at the house. Robert and Judith learned about the crash from law enforcement. The wording was almost identical to the final report. Dana pointed to a change written in the margin. The original sentence said Brittany had been upstairs when Nathan left. Someone had crossed it out and replaced it with a safer phrase stating that she remained inside the residence. The revision avoided naming any witness who might be asked to confirm where she had been. "This wasn't a memory written down after the fact," Dana said. "It was a version being edited." My father had not kept the folder because guilt made him hope someone would discover it. He had kept it because he did not trust Doyle. A note clipped to the payment record contained Doyle's initials, and the words "report" corrected as agreed. Another page recorded the date Robert believed body camera footage would be removed from active storage. The folder was insurance. If Doyle ever demanded more money or changed his story, Robert wanted proof that the deputy had participated willingly. He had preserved the evidence to protect himself, never imagining it might eventually be taken from his own safe. I sat staring at my father's handwriting and remembered the weeks after Nathan died. Whenever I asked whether anyone had spoken to Brittany about that night, Judith said my sister was too traumatized. When I questioned why the report had been completed so quickly, Robert told me to let Nathan rest. He said reopening details would not bring my husband back and would only make Chloe's grief worse. Brittany had been more subtle. At Nathan's first memorial dinner, Chloe said her father never drove carelessly. Brittany put a hand on her shoulder and told her not to turn him into someone perfect just because he was gone. When Chloe became afraid of riding on icy roads, Brittany said the fear might be useful because it would keep her from repeating Nathan's mistake. I had heard those comments and mistaken them for bluntness. Now I understood their purpose. Brittany was not only protecting herself, she was teaching Chloe which version of her father she was allowed to remember. My family had not covered one terrible night and then tried to move forward. They reinforced the lie at birthdays, holidays, and every moment when Chloe's love for Nathan threatened to contradict it. When I returned home, Chloe was sitting at the kitchen table finishing homework. She looked at my face and closed her laptop without asking whether Dana had found something. I sat beside her and told her about the folder. I did not show her every document, but I explained that her grandparents had written and preserved the false account instead of making a confused decision at the roadside. Chloe listened without interrupting. When I finished, she asked, "Did they ever love me?" The question hurt more than anything inside Robert's safe. "I think they felt love for you," I said. "But feeling love is not the same as protecting someone. They bought me presents. Grandma came to my school concerts." "I know. Was all of that fake?" "No. People can care about you and still choose themselves when caring becomes difficult. That doesn't make every good memory false. It means those memories cannot erase what they did." She looked toward the empty place on the counter, where the silver gift box had once been. "Can they still be my grandparents?" "Biologically, yes. But they do not get access to you simply because of that. Love that requires you to accept lies about your father is not safe enough to keep close." Chloe nodded, but tears gathered in her eyes. I understood then that cutting contact was not a punishment I was delivering to my parents. It was a boundary I should have given my daughter sooner. The next morning, my attorney received a proposal from Brittany's lawyer. Brittany was willing to admit she had lied about remaining at the house. She would acknowledge being present near the vehicle after the crash and claim panic had distorted her memory. In exchange, she wanted me to issue a statement, confirming that the restored video did not prove who had been driving. The statement would have been technically narrow. The video showed Brittany taking the keys and leaving with Nathan, but it did not show the crash. That technical truth was exactly why they wanted my name beneath it. They could use it to make every other piece of evidence look uncertain. Brittany also offered to apologize privately to Chloe and asked that I discourage further public correction of Nathan's report. I read the proposal twice before answering my attorney. "No." He asked whether I wanted to counter with different terms. "There are no terms. The video is evidence, not property I can bargain with. Nathan's name is not mine to trade, and neither is Chloe's memory of him." My refusal was sent without modification. Later that afternoon, Dana called. A forensic technician examining Doyle's old camera system had recovered a fragment of audio from temporary memory. The main recording had been interrupted, but a few seconds remained in a buffer that was not fully overwritten. My attorney and I returned to the county office. Dana warned us that the fragment was incomplete. It began after Doyle reached the scene and ended moments before the camera was manually disabled. She pressed play. Wind struck the microphone. A vehicle door shut. Someone was crying in the background. Then my mother's voice emerged, low but unmistakable. "Nathan is gone. Brittany still has a life." The recording stopped. I felt as though the room had tilted. Judith had reduced my husband to a completed loss while he was still breathing beside the road. Brittany's future had mattered. Nathan's life, his name, and the 12-year-old daughter waiting for him at home had become acceptable costs. Dana did not offer comfort. She looked toward the technician's report and said there was one more recoverable sentence immediately before Doyle turned off the camera. It's Brittany's voice. Dana played the recovered audio again from the beginning. Wind struck Doyle's microphone. A car door slammed. Someone nearby was crying so hard that her words broke between breaths. Then Brittany's voice came through. I was driving. I couldn't stop on the ice. The room seemed to narrow around that sentence. My mother answered immediately. Nathan is gone. Brittany still has a life. Robert's voice followed, sharper and closer to the microphone. It's Nathan's car. Right that he was alone. There was a rustle, a mechanical click, and the recording ended. Doyle had turned off his camera. For 4 years, my family had treated the truth as if it were a matter of interpretation. The road was dark. Memories were imperfect. Nathan had been found outside the vehicle. No one could be certain who sat where. Brittany's own voice removed that uncertainty. The audio did not stand alone. It joined the video, showing her take the keys. Ellen Park's call describing a woman in a red coat climbing from the driver's side. Brittany's injuries, my parents' phone locations. Doyle's missing 11 minutes, Robert's payment, the draft statement in his safe, and 4 years of conflicting explanations. Each piece had once left space for another excuse. Together, they formed a story no one could reasonably call confusion. Dana did not promise immediate arrests. She explained that the recovered audio still had to be authenticated. Prosecutors had to review the evidence, and each person's conduct had to be considered separately. The original crash, the false report, the payment, the removal of Brittany from the scene, and the later concealment did not automatically become one charge resolved in a single afternoon. For once, delay did not frighten me. The evidence had entered a process my family could no longer control. Brittany requested another interview through her attorney. She did not ask to speak privately with me. Her lawyer arranged for me and my attorney to observe from the adjoining room while Dana questioned her. Brittany arrived without the polished appearance she usually carried into every family gathering. Her hair was tied back, her face bare, and her hands remained clasped on the table. When Dana placed a transcript of the audio in front of her, Brittany read the first line and closed her eyes. I had been drinking, she said. Dana asked how much. I don't remember exactly. Do you remember taking the keys? Yes. Do you remember Nathan trying to stop you? Brittany nodded. He kept telling me to give them back. Who entered the driver's side? I did. The answer was barely audible, but it was clear. She admitted Nathan sat in the passenger seat. He told her to pull over before they reached the county road. When she refused, he reached toward the wheel and tried to persuade her to slow down. Brittany said she became angry because he was treating her like a child. At the curve, the rear tires lost traction. She turned too hard, then overcorrected. The car spun and left the road. Nathan managed to get out, but collapsed near the shoulder. Brittany crawled from the driver's side, found her phone, and called Judith. Why didn't you call 911 first? Dana asked. I was scared. Of Nathan dying? Brittany stared at the tabletop. Of everything. Her attorney asked for a break, but Brittany continued. She said my parents arrived quickly. Judith put her into Robert's vehicle and told her not to speak to the paramedics. When Doyle came, they agreed Nathan would be named as the only occupant. Brittany said she was injured, intoxicated, and unable to think clearly. Mom and Dad handled the rest, she said. Watching from behind the glass, I understood what she was trying to do. She was admitting the crash while separating herself from the cover-up, as though the lie became someone else's responsibility the moment my parents began protecting her. Dana asked who told Doyle that Nathan had left the party alone. Brittany did not answer. Your statement was written before the final report, Dana said. Did your parents invent every word without your involvement? Brittany looked toward the dark observation window. I could not tell whether she knew I was there. I told them what to say. That was the part I needed to hear, though it brought no satisfaction. Later, Brittany asked to speak to me with both attorneys present. I agreed, because I wanted there to be no future dispute over what was said. She sat across from me, in the same neutral conference room where Doyle had first admitted the report was false. I panicked that night, she said. You have to understand that. I understand panic. You work in an ER. You know people don't think normally after a crash. That explains minutes, Brittany. It doesn't explain 4 years. Her eyes filled. Mom and Dad told me the truth would destroy all of us. You watched Chloe blame her father. I didn't know how to fix it without going to prison. Every birthday was a chance. Every Christmas was a chance. Every time Chloe said she was afraid to drive because of Nathan, you had another chance. Brittany covered her mouth with one hand. You weren't panicking for 4 years, I said. You were choosing yourself. My mother still refused to accept that distinction. During a meeting arranged through counsel, Judith said the family had faced an impossible decision. One person was already dying, she argued, while another could still be saved from losing her entire future. One person was already dead, she said. We were trying to save the one who was still alive. You didn't save her, I replied. You taught her that my husband's life was cheaper than hers. Judith's expression hardened. Nathan was gone. He didn't know what the report said. He was still Chloe's father. My mother looked away. That was the truth she had never allowed into her calculation. Nathan could no longer feel the damage, but Chloe could. I could. Every person who loved him had been forced to grieve a false version of his final moments, so Brittany could continue living without consequences. Chloe did not attend those meetings. I refused to make her sit across from the adults who had altered her childhood and listen to them justify it. She wrote a statement instead. Dana allowed her to use her own words, without legal language or coaching. The final paragraph was only 2 sentences. You didn't only change a police report. You changed the way I remembered my dad. You made me afraid that the safest person I knew had become careless, when he was actually trying to stop someone else from hurting people. The prosecuting authority began formal proceedings after reviewing the authenticated audio and supporting evidence. Brittany faced consequences connected to the fatal crash and the years of concealment. Doyle faced action for falsifying records and accepting an improper financial benefit. Judith and Robert faced investigation for false statements, obstruction, and hiding evidence. No one was sentenced that week. No courtroom delivered immediate justice. Attorneys filed motions, hearings were scheduled, and every person involved began telling smaller versions of the truth in the hope that accepting part of the blame might protect them from the rest. Months later, Dana called me to the county office. She handed me a certified copy of the amended crash report. The original conclusion had been formally withdrawn. Brittany Hale was identified as the driver. Nathan Foster was identified as the passenger. The statement that he had left the party alone was marked unsupported and inaccurate. I brought the report home in a plain envelope. Chloe sat beside me at the kitchen table while I read the corrected lines aloud. My voice trembled when I reached Nathan's name, but I did not stop. For the first time, the official record described the man we remembered. Chloe placed her fingertips over the words passenger seat and held them there. Do you think I could drive to where it happened someday? She asked. I covered her hand with mine. When you're ready, I'll sit beside you. By Christmas Eve of 2027, the legal case no longer dominated every morning, but it had changed the shape of all our lives. Brittany accepted responsibility through an agreement that covered both the fatal crash and the years she helped conceal it. The woman who had once built her career around polished photographs and carefully managed impressions could no longer control which version of her name appeared in public records. Her real estate firm removed her profile, former clients stopped calling, and the people who had defended her online quietly deleted their comments. Patrick Doyle lost the remaining privileges attached to his former position. His cooperation was considered when the court reviewed his conduct, but it did not erase the false report, the money, or the 11 minutes he chose to hide. He had finally told the truth only after the records began closing around him. That made him useful to the investigation. It did not make him brave. My parents were no longer permitted to contact Chloe directly. Every message came through attorneys or arrived by mail. I had made that boundary clear after my mother left 3 voicemails, asking Chloe to remember all the good years before deciding whether one mistake should destroy a family. The letters changed in tone, but not in meaning. Judith wrote that she regretted how events had been handled. Robert wrote that fear had led them to make choices they would always carry. Neither of them wrote the sentence Chloe needed to see. We chose Brittany over your father, and then we chose that lie over you. Until they could name what they had done without softening it, I would not ask my daughter to sit across from them. Nathan's correction appeared in the local newspaper that spring. It was not printed on the front page where the original accident story had appeared, but it named Brittany as the driver and Nathan as the passenger, who had tried to stop her from driving while impaired. The garage where Nathan once worked had changed owners, but several former customers remembered him. They collected money for a small plaque beside the entrance, in memory of Nathan Foster, who understood that keeping others safe sometimes requires the courage to intervene. Chloe stood beside me when it was installed. She ran her fingers across his name, then took a photograph without posting it anywhere. Some memories did not need strangers to approve them before they became real. She had also started seeing a therapist who specialized in grief and trauma. Therapy did not remove her fear of driving. It helped her understand what the fear belonged to. At first, she drove only familiar routes in daylight. Then she practiced after dark with me beside her. When winter returned, she found an empty parking lot and learned how the car felt when tires lost traction. She still checked every mirror carefully and slowed before icy curves. But she no longer treated caution as proof that something inside her was waiting to fail. She learned that courage did not always feel calm. Sometimes it felt like fear with both hands still on the wheel. On the morning of the 24th of December 2027, Chloe came downstairs wearing Nathan's old wool gloves. The leather at the palms had thinned, and one cuff had begun to unravel. "I want to drive to County Road 14, she said. I knew which part of the road she meant. Snow had fallen overnight, but the plows had already cleared the main lanes. The sky was pale and still, with no freezing rain in the forecast. I checked the weather anyway, then stopped myself from listing every possible danger. "Are you sure?" I asked. "No," she said, "but I'm ready." She carried a small evergreen wreath to the car and placed it carefully in the back seat. I sat beside her in the passenger seat. For the first few miles, my right hand kept wanting to reach for the handle above the door. I rested it on my knee instead. I did not warn her about every patch of packed snow. I did not remind her to brake early when I could already see her slowing. Nathan had taught her how to respect a vehicle. My job was not to replace his lessons with my fear. At the turn onto County Road 14, Chloe's shoulders tightened. She took a breath, checked her mirrors, and continued. The curve looked ordinary in daylight. There was no twisted metal, no emergency lights, and no sign of the decisions that had divided our lives into before and after. Only a shallow ditch, a row of bare trees, and a county marker dusted with snow. Chloe pulled safely onto the wide shoulder and turned off the engine. We walked together to the edge of the ditch. She placed the wreath against the marker, then removed one glove and touched the cold metal with her bare hand. For a while she said nothing. I stood beside her without filling the silence. "I know you weren't the one driving," she said at last. Her voice did not break. She put the glove back on and looked toward the road. "I wish I had known sooner." "So do I." "Do you think he knew they were going to blame him?" "I don't know." That answer once would have felt unbearable. Now, it felt honest. I could not tell Chloe that Nathan had been completely returned to us. 4 years of shame could not be erased by one amended report, a newspaper correction, or a plaque. We could not recover the nights she lay awake, wondering whether she had inherited his supposed recklessness. We could not reclaim the holidays when my family watched her grieve inside a lie. But the truth had stopped the theft from continuing. Chloe drove us home. That evening, our table was smaller than the one at my parents' house, but every chair had been placed for someone invited with love rather than obligation. 2 nurses from the ER came after their shifts. Chloe's closest friend arrived with her mother and a tray of cookies. Our next-door neighbor brought soup and apologized for bringing too much, which meant there was exactly enough for everyone to take some home. No one asked us to forgive before we were ready. No one suggested that silence would make the evening more peaceful. They came because they wanted to be there, and they made Chloe laugh without asking her to pretend the year had not hurt. She had made the place cards herself. Her own card sat in the middle of the table, beside mine. It was not balanced on a folding chair near the wall, or added after everyone else had been seated. She had chosen where she wanted to sit. Nathan did not have an empty place setting. I did not want his memory to become another absence everyone had to stare at through dinner. Instead, we lit a candle beside his photograph on the sideboard. In the picture, he was laughing with one hand raised, as if he had been caught trying to avoid the camera. He was part of the room without keeping us trapped in the night we lost him. The doorbell rang while Chloe was arranging the final cards. A delivery driver handed me a plain envelope. Judith's handwriting crossed the front. For Megan and Clue. I did not tear it open. I did not throw it away either. I placed it in the top drawer of my desk. That letter belonged to Chloe, as much as it belonged to me. Someday she might choose to read it. She might decide that her grandparents had finally learned to speak without excuses, or she might find another request for forgiveness written around an apology they still could not make. The choice would be hers. Their age, their loneliness, and the date on the calendar would not make it for her. From the dining room, Chloe called, "How many places should I set?" I returned to the table and looked around at the people taking off winter coats, carrying food into the kitchen, and moving their chairs closer so no one sat apart. Only for people who know that family makes room. Chloe smiled and placed the final name card. That Christmas, my daughter did not have to stand at anyone's door and ask whether there was room for her. She already knew where she belonged.